Edward Hale, a historian and a congregational minister in America in the late 1800s, he said, "I am only one, but I am still one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something." I'm sure that you've felt very much like the first part of that statement during isolation. I am only one. If ever there is a time that the oneness of humanity is emphasised and underlined, then it's a time like this. It's lockdown. You say, I am only one, and perhaps you're even questioning, can I really do anything? Well, I trust that today's lesson, as we're continuing on in our little studies in isolation, those who were isolated in the Bible, I trust you'll be encouraged by Esther as we think about her today. See, Esther, she came to that point like Edward Hale, where she stated, I am only one, but I can do something. Esther chapter 4 is a very, very familiar chapter in the Bible for those of us who know and love our Bibles, and those of you who are familiar with the story of Esther. The previous chapter, you read of wicked Haman. He really is hatching his plot to kill the 15 million Jews that are there in Persia. In the opening chapters of the book of Esther, you read actually of Esther being providentially made queen. She replaces the current queen, Vashti, and she becomes queen to really the then king of the Persian Empire, King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, as he was known as well in secular history. And here's Esther, and in chapter 4, she then becomes aware of this predicament, of this plot to kill her people. Remember, she's a Jew, and you could have forgiven her for saying, I am only one. Here was a young Jewish woman. She was away from home. She belonged in Israel, but she's not in Israel now, no. She is in Persia. She is in a foreign land. She's away from the house of God, away from the temple, away from all that's familiar to her. And perhaps you could say then that she was locked down. She certainly was isolated at any rate. And while she was the queen of Persia, she really didn't have much of a life, and there's allusions to that in the book of Esther. Yes, she had privileges, and yes, she certainly had maids, but she lived her life in fear. And you see that through the book. And yet, while she is isolated, while she is away from Jerusalem, away from Israel, wherever she was born and raised, in isolation, yet in verse 14, Mordecai, he challenges her with those immortal words, Esther, who knoweth whether thou art come to a kingdom for such a time as this? And as a result of that, you see her spirit being stirred. Even though she feels isolated, either she's away from all that's familiar to her, you see her spirit being stirred to do something, even though she's really isolated for the Lord. And she actually ends up being the wonderful instrument for the deliverance of the Jews and the foiling of the plot of Haman to kill the Jews. And what I want you to see from Esther today really is that even though we're isolated, yet we should be stirred, like Esther, to do something. We all feel ourselves, as I said, very much to be just one in a great number, and yet we can still do something. We cannot do everything, as Edward Hale states, but whilst we are one, yet you are one, and you can do something as one. Edward Hale was also involved in publishing, and he was involved in, I think, an article, and the article was named 10 times 1 is 10. And he's really making the point that even one, when you clump 10 ones together, they become 10. Useful, even though you are but one. And so here's Esther, and she is but one. She is in Persia, and yet we see her being stirred for the Lord in isolation. So I just want to think about that thought of being stirred for the Lord in isolation from Esther chapter 4. First thing here in Esther chapter 4, as we see Esther here being stirred for the Lord in isolation, or stirred in isolation, is her challenge. In verse 8, Mordecai, her Jewish cousin, comes to her, and she's now queen, and he tells her very, very bluntly, go in unto the king. Go in unto the king. Now, that seems a very, very elementary challenge or request. Esther, go to the king. Remember, she's the queen now. She's the queen of Persia. You would think to yourself, well, this woman, she's the wife of King Ahasuerus. She should be going in and out to him all the time. And in normal society, that's what would happen in a normal relationship. But Esther as queen, she was no different really to the rest of the subjects of Persia, in the sense that she had to be bidden to go see the king. If not, she would have been very much in danger. And so she had to be asked to come into the presence of the king. But Mordecai, he says, Esther, look, the Jews, they're in trouble. You're in this position of elevation. You're the queen of Persia. You can do something. Esther, go in unto the king. He's really saying this, Esther, I want you to do something. Do something, Esther. Mordecai couldn't do anything. Haman had really had him closely monitored, and his every move and every step was closely monitored. Mordecai, that is. He couldn't do anything because of his circumstances. And yet here's Esther, and she has the possibility, she's the opportunity to do something. Child of God, isolation is difficult. It's hard. Yes, the measures are beginning to be lifted. But the challenge of God to his church and to you as an individual Christian always is this. It's to do something. To do something. The Lord Jesus has not saved you and called you to sit and to do nothing. He has called you to serve and to do something. I wonder, are you using your time, your talents, your energy, abilities? Yes, there are different circumstances in lockdown, but are you using the time and the gifts that God has given you to do something? That's always the challenge of God. We are never to be idle. We are always to be busy for the Lord. We are to do something for him. I was always challenged with the story of Bill Woods whenever he first went out to be a missionary in Brazil. And there was a case of leprosy brought to him, and he wasn't a medical doctor at this time. He was going out really as a missionary, and he couldn't treat the case. And he said to the young boy, he said, well, I'll pray for you. And the young lad said, I don't want you to pray, I want you to do something. Of course, he wrote a book later called I Want You to Do Something. And that's always the challenge to us as Christians, to the Christian church, to do something. And this is Mordecai's challenge to Esther. Esther, go in unto the king. Esther, I want you to do something, because you can. So our challenge. I want you to see then secondly here at Esther, as she's isolated, as she's away from Israel, as she's in Persia, her contemplation. As she has this challenge to go in unto the king, we read in verse 11 that, as I said, she had to be beckoned into the presence of the king. Verse 11 mentions the law of death, and it also mentions the golden scepter being extended by the king. Really what happened is, when you were beckoned into the presence of the king as a subject, he then would extend to you his scepter, really saying, look, you can now come into my presence and plead your case or speak to me. And so Esther, she had not been beckoned, and verse 11 mentions she hadn't been bidden to go to the king in 30 days. Time has passed, and she's really saying, look, if I just go into the king and plead the case of God's people, there's a possibility that I could be put to death. And that was the law at that time. And yet verse 14, Mordecai then challenges her again. Esther, who knows whether you're come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He's saying, Esther, this could be the very reason why you're queen. To use that position of influence, to use even the fact that the king favours you, Who knows, Esther, God has you here for this moment in time to serve him in this way right now. Again, child of God, there's a challenge for us there, isn't there? That God brings us into the kingdom for such a time as this. You think about isolation and all of the challenges that has presented you as a Christian personally and the Christian church in general. And yet, nonetheless, God has us here in 2020 in the midst of isolation, in the midst of lockdown. Why? For such a time as this. And I trust you see that it is God's will for you to serve him where you are, in the daily grind of life, in those little opportunities that he gives to you. Yes, they are limited, yes, they are differing, but nonetheless, he has called you to the kingdom for such a time as this. Where you are at this moment, if you can go to work, that is an opportunity. People are perhaps more fearful, they are perhaps thinking about God more than they would have a couple of months ago. They realise how frail life can be. They're surrounded by death all around them. They hear about a death count in the news every single day and the frailty of life. So you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to speak to your neighbours, to use this wisely, because God has called you into the kingdom for such a time as this. Just as he had Esther in that position right at that moment in time, so he has you. I love what it said of David in Acts chapter 13. Verse 36, Paul is in the synagogue in Antioch. It's his first missionary journey, and he sums up the life of David like this. David, he served his own generation by the will of God. He was led on sleep, and he slept with his fathers and saw corruption. Really what he's saying is David, he served his own generation, and then he died. That's how he sums up the life of King David. He said he served his own generation. It wasn't Solomon's generation, his son. It wasn't even Saul's generation, the king before him. David served his own generation. It was a hard generation. You read the life of David and really it's just battle after battle after battle. God actually said to Solomon that he was then given rest. He was given that opportunity to build the temple and so on, but David was called at a hard time to battle for the Lord, to subdue the enemies of Israel. It's hard for him, and yet he served his own generation. That hard generation, the constant battling and fighting with the Amalekites and the Philistines and so on, the Ammonites, yet he served his generation in spite of the challenges and difficulties. Child of God, are you serving your generation? This generation. God has not called you to serve your grandfather's generation or even your mother or your father's generation. It's your generation. Here, now. And Esther was challenged. And she's thinking about this now. She was called into the kingdom for such a time as this. Even though she's isolated away from Jerusalem, yet she was right there to serve the Lord. Lastly, then, I want you to see her choice. Esther's faced with this predicament. Should I go to the king even though he hasn't bidden me and I could possibly die? He hasn't asked me to come to his presence. Others have been put to death for simply barging in hastily and pleading a certain cause or case before him. Should I stay or should I go? That's really her choice. And I love her response in verse 16. If I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. She said, it doesn't matter if I die. It doesn't matter if I die presenting the case of God's people before this king. She realizes that she has an opportunity and she serves the Lord in that way, and she doesn't think about the consequences. She doesn't worry about the consequences, saying, look, even if I die, I'm going to do this. Again, child of God, I trust that you see that there is a cause greater than ours. David asked the question on the battlefield, is there not a cause? The question we ask today is there not a cause? And I trust that you have this same spirit of consecration, dedication, like Esther here, where we set our own circumstances, our own lives aside even. And it doesn't really matter about us. If I perish, I perish. I was always challenged by what Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." Esther, she was stirred in isolation to do something more for the Lord. Who knoweth whether thou come to the kingdom for such a time as this?